All right, welcome. Today, we're diving into a process that literally reshaped our modern world, one fence post at a time. We're talking about the enclosure of the commons. We're going to explore how this really physical act of dividing up land in England ended up creating a powerful new logic, a whole new way of thinking about private ownership that would eventually get exported all across the globe.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start by imagining a world without fences. Then we'll walk through the great enclosure itself, hear from some of its earliest critics, and then see how this English model became a blueprint for empire. And we'll wrap up with what the source calls the grammar of dispossession. To really get a handle on what was lost, we first have to understand the logic of what was there before. So let's start by exploring a world that was organized around a completely different set of principles, the world of the commons.
This question really gets right to the heart of it. For centuries, huge areas of English land were held collectively. I'm talking fields, forests, meadows. They weren't private property. They were a shared resource, and they formed the absolute foundation of rural life and really economic self-sufficiency.
Now, it is so important to understand that this wasn't chaos. The commons wasn't a free-for-all. It was a really organized social system, and it was governed not by deeds and titles, but by these deeply ingrained customary rights and mutual obligations. This system made sure the community could survive, everything from grazing your animals to gathering firewood. It was, in a very real sense, a social contract that wasn't written on paper, but was written right onto the landscape itself.
But then a massive change began, a change that was physical, it was brutal, and it was irreversible. And it looked, quite literally, like fences going up and signs being posted.
As you can see from the timeline, this didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, systematic process that really sped up over the centuries. And it was all made legal through thousands of parliamentary acts that basically gave the green light to seize common lands and convert them into the private estates we see today. The language they always used to justify it was improvement and progress, but for the common people, the immediate result was just mass displacement. Karl Marx gave us the classic analysis of this whole thing, calling it primitive accumulation. It's the foundational act of dispossession that has to happen before capitalism can really take off. See, by fencing off the commons, you sever peasants from their way of making a living. With no land to support themselves, they have only one thing left to sell: their labor. And just like that, enclosure creates the landless working class that the new factories needed. What's so powerful about this slide is how it captures a complete social revolution. I mean, think about it. What was once a customary right, like gathering wood, suddenly became the crime of trespassing. The landscape itself turned against you, and villagers who had freely used this land for generations were now seen as poachers and thieves. This violent transformation, well, it did not go unnoticed. In fact, some of the most powerful critiques started popping up right as the process was beginning, often from inside the English establishment itself. Way back in 1516, the statesman Sir Thomas More wrote this incredibly powerful line. The metaphor is just devastatingly clear, right? The wool industry was booming, it was super profitable, so landlords were fencing off common land for sheep pasture, and in doing so, were effectively devouring the livelihoods of the people they kicked off the land. And More's critique went even deeper than that. At the exact moment that private property was being lifted up as the sacred right, he argued the complete opposite, that it was the source of all the social problems. He saw this endless chase for private wealth not as a virtue, but as the root cause of inequality, crime, and the decay of society. Fast forward over a century, and you have this guy, Gerard Winstanley, and his followers, the Diggers. They basically took More's critique from the page and brought it out to the soil. They started cultivating common land as a form of protest, arguing that enclosure wasn't just theft, it was a spiritual crime, a violation of God's will to provide the earth as a common treasury for every single person. So here's the crucial point. This logic of fencing off land for private profit and calling it improvement, it did not stay locked up in England. It became a blueprint for building an empire. This slide just lays out the playbook perfectly. The logic of enclosure didn't just stay in England. It got exported and scaled up to justify seizing entire continents. Colonial powers would show up and declare these vast, inhabited lands as terra nullius, nobody's land, and they used the exact same justification, that the indigenous populations weren't improving the land in a way that Europeans recognized as productive. And this was no coincidence. The very same people, the nobles, the merchants, the local gentry, who got rich from enclosing English land, were the main investors in the colonial companies. They were exporting a model of dispossession that they had already perfected back home. So this brings us to a core question, right? What is the underlying mechanism that connects a simple English fence to a massive colonial frontier? There's a specific term for this grammar of dispossession. The source material calls this mechanism appropriation. Now, on one level, yeah, it's the physical act of taking a shared resource and putting it under your own exclusive control. But even more important, appropriation is the ideological framework, the story you tell, that legitimizes the act, turning what is basically a violent seizure into a lawful, orderly transaction.
See, appropriation works by creating a story. It's a story that says the land was empty, or that the people on it weren't using it properly. It's a story that redefines dispossession as development and conquest as civilization. This is the grammar, the language that powered both enclosure at home and empire abroad.
And this grammar got its most powerful philosophical defense from thinkers like John Locke. His theory that property is created when a person mixes their labor with the land became, as the source puts it, a moral fig leaf for theft. It provided this very sophisticated justification for colonists to claim indigenous lands that they said they were going to improve. And this all leaves us with a really critical question for today. This process of appropriation, of taking a common resource, whether it's land, water, or even digital information, and turning it into a private, excludable commodity, that process is not just history. The grammar of dispossession is still being written, which forces us to ask, what legal masks does conquest wear today?